Thank you for attending Spatial Responses to COVID. In this case study, I'm going to describe the way that we responded to the COVID pandemic in three spaces in the School of Architecture and Design at Virginia Tech. And all three spaces were approached slightly differently, but we had two definitely different approaches that I want to describe. So as an overview, I'm sure everyone's very aware at this point as to the context in higher education when in early 2020 we went into a series of different types of lockdowns. Across the United States, the approach was varied. The other thing that I want to talk about is some of the way that research evolved during this time and how this was either integrated or ignored in these different approaches that I'm going to describe to you. And then finally, what we learned and what we can take forward as a part of this experience, basically. So the response to COVID-19 in the United States has been politicized. I don't think anyone is surprised by that. That has happened in other locations around the world. And instead of being able to react purely along health guidelines that would protect people from the spread of disease, there were a lot of other things involved in the responses in the United States and, of course, other places. In addition to that, there were changing messages coming out of the Center for Disease Control throughout the period of time, particularly early in the pandemic. An example of this is related to masks. At first, they were saying they didn't do any good or weren't required or shouldn't be needed. And then, of course, that changed. And now there's still mask mandates in places that are in place. Virginia Tech, which is the location that I'm talking about, had an immediate response. The school went to 100% online over spring break in March of 2020. This forced the faculty to figure out how to take very highly intensive in-person experiences of teaching design studio and to figure out how to do that online, basically within a week's period of time. Then in the summer of 2020, after there was a great deal of negative response from students in particular to being online, the solution was that the university would go through and determine maximum occupancies for all of the various spaces and that some sort of hybrid situation would result from that. So things that had to be in person, like labs and studios, could be in person, whereas lecture courses had to be online because there was no way to teach everybody in the same spaces that we normally use. And so that was the approach during the academic year 2020 to 2021. So that was fall 2020, spring 2021. And just to complete the loop, we went back to fully in-person and regular capacity in fall of 2021, which is where we are now. In addition to this, just as a part of the context, several experts at Virginia Tech were actually being interviewed nationally on their expertise related to aerosol spread of the vaccine in the case of Lindsay Marr. And then we had a professor in engineering who was looking at the ineffectiveness of plexiglass as a way to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. So both of these things were happening at Virginia Tech at the same time that we were making these decisions. So I'm going to introduce you to the three spaces here. The first of these is Birchard. It accommodates somewhere around 304 students in a variety of studios. It is entirely underground, so there are no operable windows. And it is one big, large open space. This particular space continued in use throughout the duration of the pandemic, and we'll talk about, this is kind of the before and after plan. So this is the way it was set up prior to social distancing and all of those things that we did to try and make it a safe space. And this is where it is again this fall. So one of the things that was important to do here was there was a sort of pedagogical decision made. So we have 4 majors in the School of Architecture and Design: industrial design, interior design, landscape architecture, and architecture. 3 of those 4 majors decided they wanted to retain the all studios being held at the same time, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, either 8 to noon for foundation studio or from 1 to 5 for all upper level years. And so this building, as well as Kogel, which I will talk about, retained those fully in-person studios all at the same time with those 3 majors. So everybody was in here at once. So the COVID plan that was developed allowed for groupings of 4. You can see the layout here, in addition to try to accommodate the capacity with social distancing. Students were put into the side rooms, which are used as classrooms, and so on. What I want to say about this is that early on, we became aware, some people became aware of the research being done on plexiglass. At that time, the school had already ordered an enormous amount of colored plexiglass. And so it was really introduced using Instagram and other social media accounts. Videos were made showing it as just this sort of cool design space. And it was really sold to students and people in various programs and to the public as being a great design response to the pandemic. So early on, there were these sort of renderings that were made using Revit and Enscape to show how great it would be. This is that underground space in Birchard that I'm talking about, and you can see there were markings put on the floor for which direction to go. There were colored plexiglass between the 4 desks in these pods of 4, and this was what they were proposing it would look like. Here is what it actually looked like, and you can see that they were pieces of heavily saturated plexiglass. And keep in mind, these are for design programs. So this was what it was looking like as it was being assembled. And here's another view of that once students had started to move in. And another view just so that you can get an idea what it was like to be walking through this space. Again, all underground, no operable windows, and operating at near full capacity. The second building I want to talk about is Kogel Hall. This was primarily the location of architecture studios. Birchard accommodated both industrial design, architecture, and the kind of combined foundation studios were there as well. Kogel was primarily architecture with a few of the combined foundation studios. And so the 3rd floor is the most densely populated. This is what it looks like now, and this is what it looked like before spring of 2020. Here is the COVID plan, and again, you will see the attempt to maintain a very similar occupancy by putting students in the classrooms, which are located at the center and in the middle to the left and right. Again, full capacity with directional walking paths and the use of plexiglass to separate the student desks. But their backs were open to the walkway, which is really significant with regard to the research being done on plexiglass, which was that it could actually trap the aerosols. So rather than keeping the students safe from the people across from them, which it did do, They were open at the back to anyone who walked behind them. Here is the main lobby of Kogel Hall. Again, the directional signage was used. Students were placed in the main lobby of the building. This is where the dean's office, the school director's office, and so on. They're all located on this floor, and students were located right near the front doors off this main lobby. And here is another view showing an extension of the lobby and the access to the dean's office and the school director's office. And the colored plexiglass was used throughout here as well. Just another view of that. Here is an example of one of the open floor plates in Kogel Hall with the students sitting with their backs to each other and the walkways running between there with the colored plexiglass again. And here is another view as it was being completed and set up. These are the actual students who were hired to install all of this plexiglass throughout Kogel Hall and Birchard. The third building I want to talk about is Burris Hall. This is where the interior design spaces are, faculty offices, and student offices for the second, third, and fourth year of the interior design program. The decision was made early on after consulting with peers across the country, as well as the research being done by offices such as Gensler and the research being done at Virginia Tech about plexiglass and aerosols. And the decision was made that the better approach for us, particularly concerning the fact that we use a lot of color, was not to install colored plexiglass. So what we chose to do instead, I will describe in detail, but basically here you're seeing the pre and post COVID plan. So there are about 120 desks in here. There are 3 different sections which are usually allocated to second, third, and fourth year of the interior design program. And then, as I mentioned, the faculty offices are along the side. So this is the way it looks now. This is the way it looked before the pandemic. Here is what we chose to do as a response. So the first thing is, you'll notice in red the limit of the maximum number of people the university said could be in each of these spaces at one time. So 2 of the studios were limited to 10. Our classroom, which normally accommodated 45 students, was limited to 6. And our larger studio was limited to 12. So at any given time, the maximum number of students that could be in this space was 38. Coincidentally, our largest studio at the time was the junior studio, which had 37 students. And that's pretty typical. It's usually in the 30s. So what we chose to do was a layout where each year was sprinkled throughout all the spaces to get to that maximum occupancy of 38 without overloading any of the individual spaces in accordance with what the university had recommended. We then came up with a staggered studio time. So the students were still able to have access to their desk for 4 hours on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The times were just different. So the senior studios were in the morning. The junior studios spanned late morning to early afternoon, and the sophomore studios were then later in the afternoon. So you can see they're color-coded here by blue, the light red color, or yellow. And they were assigned desks, which wasn't popular, but it was a way to kind of work out the equity of distributing people throughout the studios. This is what that layout ended up looking like. So there were no plexiglass barriers. It was all done through social distancing and wearing masks. There are operable windows in this building, which is different from either Birchard, which was underground, or Kogel. Kogel has fixed windows. So the idea was to comply with the guidelines that the university had put forth about maximum occupancies based on their analysis of the ventilation systems in each building. Then we also relied on all of the other measures that came out during that year regarding, using frequent hand washing, social distancing, wearing masks at all times, and so on. So that was kind of the third approach. So in conclusion, some of the lessons we learned, the first thing is it's really important to follow and to listen to the research as it's coming out in the midst of a crisis. This wasn't done uniformly. It was done in at least one case, but not in all cases. The second thing is you have to be able to be flexible and respond. Just because you start setting up things a certain way, if you find out that isn't the best way, you need to be able to make those changes. The spatial distancing or social distancing with the 6-foot diameter circles around everybody's head is how we did it. Masks, staggered schedules seem to be very effective. Some transferable lessons that might inform design education in the future is and we did not have this in place, is to have really well-enabled classrooms for virtual learning, so Zoom-enabled classrooms in our case. We had projectors, we had, rudimentary systems, but they were not good for trying to do any kind of hybrid teaching. Masks reduced the spread of other illnesses. The incident of flu went down significantly in our studios, and that was kind of a custom thing that we expected every fall. And that had us think that maybe the level of density that we were using was too high in 4-hour segments throughout the day to put people in those highly dense situations. Maybe that isn't the best thing to do in any situation. The last piece of that was we really learned the importance of having operable windows to allow for fresh air ventilation. Some unintended consequences. Early on, to be honest, one of the reasons interior design chose not to use plexiglass is because we're working with color all the time, and having colored plexiglass reflecting on computer monitors and material samples and those sorts of things just wasn't practical. But as it turns out, as the research started to come out about plexiglass trapping these aerosols and not really helping to prevent the spread of the virus in most cases, those things sort of combined to have us make this decision, which turned out to be the right decision. So thank you for listening. I hope this is informative to you, and it's been my pleasure speaking to you today.